I've always loved Halloween. Ever since I was a kid, something about the crisp autumn air, the rustling leaves, and the permission to become someone else for a day captivated me. Now, as a 38-year-old architectural engineer with my own home in the Pleasant Pines subdivision, I could finally create the Halloween display I'd always dreamed of. Nothing grotesque or terrifying. Just an atmospheric yard that would make neighborhood kids' eyes light up with wonder. Little did I know, my harmless decorations would lead to an exorcism, 3 police reports, and the complete implosion of Diane Wheeler's career and social standing. It all started last September when I moved into Pleasant Pines, a modestly upscale neighborhood with neat lawns and tasteful homes. I'd saved for years to afford the charming 2-story craftsman house with its spacious yard. The previous owners mentioned something vague about the Homeowners Association, HOA, being particular, but having lived under HOA rules before, I figured I could manage. The welcome packet came with a 64-page rulebook printed on premium paper, complete with the association logo embossed in Boston gold. Admittedly, I skimmed it. My first red flag should have been the 23-page section on appropriate mailbox maintenance. I met Diane Wheeler, the HOA president, during my second week in the neighborhood. She appeared at my door one Tuesday evening for what she called a welcome inspection. Standing on my porch, clipboard in hand, pearls gleaming against her crisp white blouse, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, she seemed stretched into a permanent expression of mild disapproval. "Just making sure everything is up to Pleasant Pine standards," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She proceeded to note that my mailbox numbers were 3/4 of an inch too small. My garage door was the wrong shade of beige, eggshell, not cream. And my welcome mat was inappropriately whimsical. I thought her comment about the mat come back with a warrant was funny. Diane did not. I fixed the mailbox numbers and promised to look into the garage door color, but I kept the mat, a small rebellion. Diane sent 3 increasingly urgent emails over the next month about the mat, treating my doorstep humor like a neighborhood emergency. I replaced it only when she mentioned potential fines, but by then, I already knew we had fundamentally different views on what mattered in life. Fast forward to October 1st. I'd spent weeks planning my Halloween display and the entire previous weekend setting it up. Nothing was gory or inappropriate for children. I created an ethereal graveyard with tombstones engraved with pun names like My Remains and Al Back. Wisps of fog drifted between them, generated by carefully placed fog machines. Soft blue and purple lights illuminated the scene, and speakers played subtle atmospheric music. Nothing loud enough to disturb anyone. The centerpiece was a life-size ghost bride standing before a specially constructed archway. Her veil and dress moved gently in the breeze created by a concealed fan. I'd engineered her myself using lightweight fabrics and a sophisticated internal frame that allowed for subtle movements. During the day, it was charming. At night, with the lighting and music, it was magical. At 7:45 a.m. on October 2nd, the doorbell rang. I opened it, coffee in hand, to find Diane and 2 other members of the HOA board. "We've received several complaints," Diane announced, though I knew for a fact that my immediate neighbors had complimented my display just the evening before. Diane held a manila folder labeled Halloween Violations under her arm. "Your decorations exceed the allowed square footage for seasonal displays, violate the noise ordinance, and create a safety hazard." I blinked sleep from my eyes. The whole display is under the square footage limit. I measured it. The music can barely be heard from the sidewalk, and everything is safely secured and away from walkways. I even researched the rules thoroughly for this project. Diane's mouth tightened. The guidelines clearly state that Halloween decorations cannot be erected before October 15th. That's not in the rulebook I received, I said, now fully awake. It was in the addendum sent last spring, replied one of the other board members, a tall man with a permanently sunburned face whose name I couldn't remember. I took a deep breath. I never received any addendum. Honestly, several other houses already have pumpkins and fall wreaths up. Those are autumn decorations, not Halloween-specific. Diane snapped. Your display is clearly Halloween-themed and must be removed by sundown, or you'll be fined $50 per day of non-compliance. I wanted to argue further, but had a 9 o'clock meeting I couldn't miss. I'll look into it, I said, closing the door perhaps a bit more firmly than necessary. That evening, I searched through every email the HOA had ever sent me. No addendum. I checked the official HOA website. No updated rules about Halloween timing. I even asked my next-door neighbor, Maria, who confirmed she'd never heard of the October 15th rule. Diane makes things up when she doesn't like something, Maria whispered, looking over her shoulder as though the HOA president might be lurking in the bushes. Last year, she told the Patels their Diwali lights were against code. They weren't. I decided to stand my ground. My display was tasteful, compliant with the written rules, and already a hit with the neighborhood children, who stopped to admire it on their way home from school. I sent a polite but firm email to the HOA board, asking them to cite the specific written rule I was violating, along with documentation. Diane's response came at 11:23 that night. The board has full discretion to interpret seasonal decoration guidelines in the interest of maintaining neighborhood standards and property values. No citation, no documentation, just royal decree. The next evening, I returned home from work to find a violation notice taped to my door, and my ghost bride altered. Someone had placed a large wooden cross on her, secured with what looked like actual nails driven through the delicate framework I'd built. The fabric was torn in several places, and a printed Bible verse about witchcraft was stapled to her flowing train. The cross had damaged the internal mechanism, and now, instead of elegant, subtle movements, she jerked spasmodically, which, I had to admit, made her look significantly more disturbing. I was photographing the damage when Maria hurried over from next door. I saw who did it, she said in a low voice. It was Diane and Pastor Mike from that new church on Westfield Road. They were here for like 20 minutes this afternoon. I have it on my doorbell camera. They vandalized my property? I said, still processing the situation. Diane was telling Pastor Mike that your display was drawing evil energies to the neighborhood, Maria continued. She said her migraines have gotten worse since you put it up, and she's sure it's connected. Pastor Mike said something about spiritual warfare, and then they got to work with the cross. I carefully removed the cross and the Bible verses, but the damage was done. The ghost bride now moved in an unintentionally creepy manner, and the tears in her gown gave her a more haunting appearance. Ironically, Diane's vandalism had transformed my whimsical display into something genuinely eerie. I considered taking it all down, but felt a flash of indignation. Why should I let someone else's irrational behavior dictate what I could do on my own property? Instead of dismantling my display, I repaired what I could and adjusted the lighting to work with the ghost bride's new jerky movements. I added a sign. Recently disturbed by trespassers. Please respect the dead. It was passive-aggressive, sure, but less aggressive than driving nails through someone else's property. I also filed a police report about the vandalism and sent a carefully worded email to the HOA board, minus Diane, with Maria's doorbell camera footage attached. I explained that while I respected everyone's right to their religious beliefs, damaging others' property was illegal, and I would be pursuing the matter. I kept my tone professional and unemotional, despite my anger. The next day was Friday, and I came home to find 3 separate violation notices on my door. One claimed my grass was 1/4 inch too tall. It wasn't. Another cited excessive nighttime illumination from my display, though my immediate neighbors had much brighter permanent landscape lighting. And the third was for storage of construction materials in public view, because I'd briefly placed a package of replacement light bulbs on my front porch. As I was reading these notices, a black SUV pulled up, and a man in dark clothing stepped out, carrying what looked like a doctor's bag. He was followed by Diane, 2 other HOA board members, and an older woman in flowing robes holding what appeared to be a bundle of herbs. They marched up my walkway with the grim determination of a medieval mob, minus the torches. "Mr. Bennett," Diane said, not bothering with pleasantries, "this is Pastor Mike Fletcher, our HOA attorney Gerald Winters, board secretary Pamela Hodge, and spiritual cleanser Madame Rowena. We're here to address the demonic portal you've opened in our community." I stared at them, momentarily speechless. There's no demonic portal. It's just Halloween decorations. Pastor Mike stepped forward, opening his bag to reveal bottles of what I assumed was holy water, several crosses and what looked like salt. "Son, sometimes we invite darkness without realizing it. Your display has elements that mimic burial grounds and summoning circles." "They're foam tombstones from the Halloween store," I pointed out, "and the circle is just lights arranged around the fog machine to hide it." Madame Rowena shook her head solemnly, her numerous necklaces clinking. "I sense multiple entities, very restless, very angry. The only restless, angry entity around here is standing right next to you," I said, nodding toward Diane. "Look, I filed a police report about the vandalism of my property. I have video evidence. Unless you want to add trespassing to the charges, I suggest you all leave now." Gerald, the attorney, cleared his throat. "Mr. Bennett, the HOA covenant gives the board the right of access for inspection purposes for legitimate HOA business." I interrupted. "Exorcisms aren't covered in the bylaws. I checked. And while we're citing rules, I'd like to point out that religious discrimination is against federal housing laws." I wasn't entirely sure if that applied here, but it sounded good, and Gerald's momentary hesitation suggested I might be on to something. Diane's face flushed. "This isn't about religion. It's about community standards. 3 different families have reported their children having nightmares since your display went up." Just then, a group of middle schoolers walked by, stopped to admire my display, and asked if they could take pictures with the ghost bride. Their enthusiasm somewhat undermined Diane's claim about traumatized children. "I think we're done here," I said firmly. "Please leave my property." They retreated, but not before Madame Rowena tossed a handful of herbs onto my lawn, and Pastor Mike sprinkled what I hoped was water along my property line. That night, around 9:30 p.m., I heard chanting outside. Diane, Pastor Mike, and Madame Rowena had returned and were circling my yard, holding candles and reciting something that sounded like a mixture of Latin and nonsense. Several neighbors had come out to watch, most looking embarrassed or amused. I called the non-emergency police line, and 2 officers arrived within minutes. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, showing them the earlier police report about the vandalism and Maria's video footage. The officers spoke to Diane and her exorcism team, explaining that while they had the right to practice their religion, they couldn't do so on my property without permission, and the noise ordinance prohibited loud activities after 9 p.m. As they were leaving, with Diane loudly protesting about satanic influences, Officer Rodriguez quietly told me, "We've had issues with Miss Wheeler before. If you have security cameras, I'd make sure they're working." His knowing look told me volumes about Diane's reputation with local law enforcement. The next morning, Saturday, I installed additional security cameras covering every angle of my yard, an expense I hadn't planned but felt necessary. I also discovered that overnight someone had scattered salt in a thick line around my entire property. Given that it had rained lightly, this meant someone had come back after the police left to create their mystical boundary. Throughout the day, neighbors stopped by, some to express support, others out of simple curiosity. The story of the attempted exorcism had spread rapidly. Most people seemed embarrassed by Diane's behavior, though a few expressed concerns about the display now that the damaged ghost bride moved in a more disturbing manner. I explained what had happened, and most were appalled at the vandalism, regardless of their feelings about the decorations themselves. That evening, as dusk fell, I noticed an unusual number of cars driving slowly past my house. Word had gotten out beyond our neighborhood, and people were coming specifically to see the haunted house that needed an exorcism. A few visitors asked if they could take photos, which I allowed. Someone posted about it on social media, and by Sunday evening my previously unremarkable Halloween display had become something of a local attraction. On Monday morning, I received an official-looking letter from Gerald Winter's law office threatening legal action for creating a public nuisance and intentionally reducing property values through excessive attraction of non-resident visitors. The letter demanded I immediately remove all Halloween decorations and pay a $1,000 fine to the HOA for remediation of community disruption. I consulted my own attorney, who laughed out loud at the letter. "They vandalized your property, performed religious rituals on your lawn without permission, and now they're upset because people are coming to see what all the fuss is about? That's rich." She helped me draft a response that politely but firmly rejected their demands, and countered with my own compensation for the damaged ghost bride, a written apology, and a commitment to follow the actual written HOA rules rather than Diane's personal interpretations. Tuesday brought a new development. A local news van was parked at the entrance to our subdivision when I left for work. By the time I returned home, my story had made the early evening news. The reporter had interviewed several neighbors, most of whom came across as reasonable people embarrassed by their HOA president's behavior. Diane had apparently given a heated interview in which she referred to my display as satanic, demonic, and spiritually dangerous, while Pastor Mike stood beside her, nodding gravely. The reporter juxtaposed these claims with footage of my display, which looked rather tame, even with the now jerky movements of the damaged ghost bride. The story caught the attention of a civil liberties organization, who contacted me offering legal support if needed. They were particularly concerned about the religious aspects of the conflict and what they saw as clear religious discrimination. I appreciated their offer, but hoped it wouldn't come to that. Wednesday brought no direct confrontations, but I noticed Diane standing across the street for almost an hour, taking photos of everyone who stopped to look at my display. When children from the elementary school walked by after dismissal, she approached them, presumably to tell them something about my house. Several parents intervened, and I saw some heated conversations taking place. On Thursday morning, I received a call from Richard Torres, another HOA board member. "Look, this has gotten out of hand," he said, sounding tired. "Some of us on the board think Diane is taking this too far. The news coverage makes us all look crazy. I'm open to reasonable solutions." "I've never wanted conflict," I told him. "I just want to enjoy Halloween without having my property vandalized or being accused of opening portals to hell." Richard sighed. "There's an emergency board meeting tonight. I can't promise anything, but several members are questioning Diane's judgment." That evening, my doorbell rang around 8:30 p.m. It was Richard, looking both relieved and uncomfortable. The board voted 4-3 to rescind all violation notices against you and to formally apologize for the incidents. Diane resigned in protest, effective immediately. I'm the interim president until our January elections. I invited him in, and, over coffee, he explained that the news coverage had prompted calls from other homeowners questioning the board's actions. Additionally, the HOA's insurance company had contacted them with concerns about liability for the property damage and potential religious discrimination claims. Plus, Richard admitted, most of us just want our quiet neighborhood back. The constant drama is exhausting. We agreed that I would accept the apology and not pursue further action against the HOA as an organization, provided they covered the cost of repairing my ghost bride. Richard seemed relieved by my reasonableness, commenting that Diane had described me as combative and uncooperative. I just wanted to decorate for Halloween, I told him. I never wanted to be at war with the HOA. The story might have ended there, but the internet has a way of keeping things alive. The local news segment had been picked up by several national websites focused on HOA horror stories and neighborhood disputes. By Friday, it had gone viral, with headlines like HOA President Performs Exorcism on Halloween Display and Ghost Bride Exorcised in Suburban Showdown. Someone created a Facebook page called Justice for the Ghost Bride, which gained thousands of followers in days. People began driving from other towns to see my display, creating legitimate traffic concerns on our quiet streets. I felt bad about the disruption and posted signs asking visitors to be respectful of neighbors and to only visit during reasonable hours. The unexpected viral fame had consequences for Diane as well. It turned out she worked as a real estate agent, specializing, ironically, in helping clients find homes in family-friendly communities with stable property values. Her brokerage firm was flooded with calls and negative reviews from people who'd seen the story. According to Maria, who seemed to know everyone's business, Diane was placed on leave pending an internal review. Pastor Mike's church also faced scrutiny when it emerged that they weren't affiliated with any recognized denomination and had been operating out of a rented storefront without proper permits for their spiritual healing services. The city was now investigating whether they were running an unauthorized business. As for Madame Rowena, she apparently saw the viral attention as a marketing opportunity and was now advertising protection from Halloween energy services on her newly created website. The following Wednesday, exactly 3 weeks after the first confrontation about my decorations, I arrived home to find a small group of neighbors in my driveway. For a moment, I feared another confrontation, but they greeted me with smiles. "We wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner," said Frank Lopez from 2 doors down. None of us thought Diane would go that far, and many of us were afraid of becoming her next target if we intervened. "We took up a collection," added Maria, holding out an envelope. "It's to help replace your ghost bride or to add to your display next year, whatever you prefer." I was genuinely moved by the gesture. "That's incredibly kind, but not necessary." "We insist," said Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman I'd barely spoken to before. "Besides, we have an ulterior motive. We're hoping you'll consider joining the HOA board in January. We need someone with a spine who knows the actual rules." The following weekend, many neighbors brought their children to trick-or-treat at my house, well ahead of Halloween, knowing that on the actual holiday I might be too swamped with visitors to give them personal attention. Several parents thanked me for standing my ground, saying that Diane's reign of selective rule enforcement had been making the neighborhood less friendly for years. My Halloween display remained up through October 31st, drawing steady streams of visitors. Many left small offerings for the ghost bride. flowers, tokens, notes of support. I added a donation box for the local children's hospital, which collected over $2,000 by Halloween night. Diane put her house on the market in early November. According to the neighborhood grapevine, her real estate license was under review following complaints about her professional conduct. Pastor Mike's church closed abruptly, with a sign on the door saying they were relocating to better serve their mission. Madame Rowena, ever the entrepreneur, was now offering space-clearing services for homes affected by negative HOA energies. Winter came, and the ghost bride was carefully packed away, damaged but somehow more meaningful now. In January, I was elected to the HOA board along with several other neighbors who wanted a more reasonable, transparent approach to community governance. Our first act was to rewrite the seasonal decoration guidelines to be clearer and more inclusive of diverse traditions. As for me, I've started planning next year's Halloween display. Nothing too extreme. I'm not looking to become that house permanently, but the ghost bride will return, scars and all. Some neighbors have asked if they can contribute elements to create a neighborhood-wide theme. Even Mrs. Chen, who initially thought my display was a bit much, has offered her front yard as space for an extension of the ghostly scene. Sometimes I wonder if Diane knows that her crusade against my Halloween decorations not only failed, but backfired spectacularly, bringing the neighborhood closer together in ways it hadn't been before. I imagine her driving by someday, seeing multiple houses with cohesive Halloween displays, neighbors chatting as they help each other set up decorations, children excitedly planning their routes through our now famous haunted lane. I like to think there's a lesson here about community tolerance and the unintended consequences of trying to control others. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Sometimes the monsters aren't the ones in the decorations, and sometimes what looks like a ghost is just someone trying to bring a little magic into the world. Either way, I've never been more excited for next Halloween. And if I happen to install a special effects feature that makes the ghost bride whisper "Diane" when specific frequencies are detected, well, that would just be a coincidence. A completely random, technically sophisticated coincidence.